Of all England's kings and queens, Elizabeth I is the most famous. She was imperious, cunning, sexy, ruthless, and feminine. She's become the star of movies, books, television. She was, above all, supremely successful. And yet, mysteries remain. How did Elizabeth manage to prevail against such enormous odds in what was a man's world? And why did she never marry? Was it because sexually she was not fully a woman? Or was it rather because to Elizabeth, her virginity was always the key instrument of her power? On the 17th of November, 1558, a messenger set out from London for Hatfield House in Hertfordshire. A young woman was waiting anxiously. The messenger carried momentous news. 6 hours earlier, his loyalty was to the Catholic Queen Mary. Now she was dead, and the country was ruled by a Protestant queen, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the daughter of King Henry VIII by his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Now, Henry's marriage to Anne had been bigamous. He was still in the process of detaching himself from wife number one, Catherine of Aragon. So, strictly speaking, Elizabeth was illegitimate. And, strictly speaking, the illegitimate had no right to succession. The birth of Elizabeth, a girl, had been a dreadful blow to Henry. He'd felt sure that where his first marriage had failed, Anne would bring him a male heir. When she didn't, he had no use for her. Henry looked for a third wife, and Anne Boleyn had her head chopped off. Elizabeth was only 3. She never got to know her mother. She grew up mainly here at Hatfield House to the north of London, with her own little circle of ladies-in-waiting and tutors. The seeds of independence in her were sown at a very early age. Elizabeth was clever and confident. As a young girl, she became fluent in 5 different languages. She studied history and philosophy. She also loved riding and shooting with a crossbow. By 1537, Henry had fathered 3 children. The first was Mary, Elizabeth's elder half-sister, and the Catholic daughter of Henry's first wife. Mary now came to live with Elizabeth, whom she immediately considered a spoilt Protestant brat, but after a while became fond of her. Then they were joined by their younger brother, Edward, who, like Elizabeth, was Protestant, the son of their father's third wife, Jane Seymour. Together, this odd little group of half-sisters and brother enjoyed all the pleasures of country living. There were gardens for contemplation, there were parks for hunting in, and there were tutors for the advancement of their learning. But Elizabeth must have realized that what united the 3 of them was their father, still alive. Their mothers were all dead. This seemed like a world in which women were dispensable. Henry VIII had been a distant father and seen little of Elizabeth since her mother's execution. By 1544, he was a man in decline, dealing with the mess of his, by now, 5 disastrous marriages. He began to feel it was time for reconciliation. On June the 26th, in 1544, Henry invited all 3 of his children to a grand banquet in Whitehall. It was followed by a reception at which they were introduced to the court, and he announced the order of succession. First was going to come Edward, his son, then his oldest daughter, Mary, and finally Elizabeth. But with two ahead of her in line for the succession, a princess she might be, but a queen, surely never. Henry was at last taking a fatherly interest in Elizabeth, and she responded. Shortly after the banquet, Elizabeth wrote to Henry, hailing him as matchless and most benevolent father. She said she was determined to be not only an imitator of his virtues, but indeed an inheritor of them. She was only 12 years old, but clearly saw herself as a chip off the old block. 3 years later, her father died, and his young Protestant son Edward came to the throne. Elizabeth liked and trusted Edward. She did very well out of his reign, acquiring dozens of large estates, including this one here at Hatfield, her principal residence. But 6 years on, Edward too was dead. The devoutly Catholic Mary came to the throne. For Elizabeth, her sister spelt danger. Mary began fiercely to dismantle the Protestant state and wanted Elizabeth, who was now her successor, to convert to Catholicism. Elizabeth kept making excuses. The relationship between the two sisters became hostile. Then Mary announced her intention of marrying Philip of Spain, a Catholic and a foreigner, loathed by England's Protestants. Whether she liked it or not, Elizabeth now became the Protestants' rallying point and a threat to Mary. Insurrection was in the air.